environmental racism is the idea that people of color are disproportionately impacted by a wide variety of different types of environmental problems. That could be pollution, hazardous land uses, even their reduced access to environmental benefits such as parks and clean air, things like that. The term environmental racism was developed in a very specific historical context. It was developed out of a case in Warren County, North Carolina in the early 1980s. I don't know if it was the county or if it was a firm that was dumping PVC tainted soil all along the county. They were dumping it along the side of the road. And as the community found out about it, they began mobilizing. And initially, actually, it was a black and white community. But eventually, a lot of African Americans became involved, including some who had a history in the civil rights movement. And they kind of took that frame, that mobilizing frame around civil rights movement, and they applied it to an environmental problem. And that's where the term was coined, environmental racism. I think it was a very powerful kind of term that really picked up on a lot of the history of struggle of people of color in the United States. And it had, I think, a lot of initial kind of leverage in terms of trying to pressure the state as well as local polluters in addressing these problems. This isn't to say that environmental racism developed at this particular point in time. The problems of people of color, of poor people, not receiving the full benefits of the environmental movement or historically bearing the burden for industrialization and other forms of hazardous land uses is very, very old in the United States, as it is throughout most countries in the world, I would assume. This is a very long-standing problem, but it was only in this particular point in time that we began recognizing it as a form of inequality and people began mobilizing around it. Now, the term environmental justice, to me, refers to the movement that has developed to respond to these kinds of problems. I think the term environmental justice is much broader than the term environmental racism, because environmental justice can refer to terms, to communities that are mobilizing along what they see as environmental inequities along any different kind of line of difference. So it could be economic lines, it could be ethnic lines, it could be linguistic lines, any different ways in which power is being, power and inequality is being produced. I guess it did develop initially in the United States in response to environmental racism, but also at the same time, or just prior to the development of environmental racism, there was the anti-toxic movement in the United States as well. And these were communities who didn't necessarily define themselves along racial lines. They began mobilizing against both the polluters, and they began quickly realizing that the state was complicit with the polluters. And they also were really important source of mobilization to the environmental justice movement. So we see a couple of strands coming together in the development of the environmental justice movement. We see the anti-toxic movement, we see then communities that are mobilizing on the basis of race, coming together and creating what we call the environmental justice movement, which really began challenging mainstream environmental organizations, the mainstream environmental movement, and asking the questions, well, why aren't you addressing these issues? Where's your urban environmental agenda? They began critiquing the mainstream environmental movement for being overly preoccupied with questions of wilderness, for example, instead of focusing on the everyday environments of working class people, on people of color. These criticism charges were necessarily entirely accurate or fair. The environmental movement up to this time had done quite a bit to begin addressing more general environmental problems that affect everybody. For example, air quality, water quality, these kinds of things. But nonetheless, it is very true that they were not addressing questions of the inequities or the inequalities in terms of how that pollution and its problems are distributed. The environmental movement up to that time really did see itself, I think, as like speaking for everybody. And this became one of the critiques of the environmental justice movement. They very much challenged the mainstream environmental movement in terms of its positionality, in terms of its legitimacy, in working class communities and communities of color, and saying, you know, you don't have the right to speak for us. You don't come from our experience. You don't know what it's like. You come from a more privileged position. So that becomes a really important theme of the environmental justice movement, the idea that we speak for ourselves. Another important idea, I think, with the within the environmental justice movement is they began challenging mainstream science and really understanding that the different uses of science, how science is produced, how it can be beneficial to both the state and to corporations in terms of continuing in their marginalization of these communities. Real big effort to begin politicizing a lot of the science that was coming out of, for example, regulatory agencies, and people producing their own science, which I think was really very powerful and very empowering as people began to develop those own tools and question science in a really powerful kind of way. So that becomes another major theme of the environmental justice movement. Another theme of the environmental justice movement is, again, challenging that idea, the focus of mainstream environmentalism. While they critiqued mainstream environmentalism as being overly preoccupied with wilderness or the nature out there, they began redefining environmentalism as where we live, work, and play. And that's the idea that of the everyday environmentalism, focusing on the environment of the community, the workplace, the play yard, the school, all those kinds of places. One of the most exciting things that I have seen, I think, has been then the export of environmental justice to other parts of the world. Again, this is not to say that other parts of the world were not dealing with these issues earlier. I remember very early on, like in the 1980s, reading about the Chipko movement in India, in which poor women who depended on the forest resources began defending the forest from industry in which they were being, in which logging was going on. That's something that we would call an environmental justice struggle today, but we didn't necessarily call it that at the time. It was the beginnings of the development of a subaltern environmentalism, as Gutta has said. I think the term environmental justice has since been extrapolated to other places, and I think it's a potentially very powerful term for mobilization. The term has also kind of mutated or been picked up by other kinds of smaller strands of environmentalism. So, for example, we talk about climate justice, food justice. Julie C. talks about energy justice. So the whole idea of applying the idea of justice to a variety of different kinds of environmental, public health concerns, I think, has really taken on and developed a life of its own in a very exciting kind of way.